And good evening. Today is Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. I'm your host, Evan George, and welcome to Bostopia Nightly News. On tonight's show tonight, we have Andrea Campbell's statements on why she will not be passing the budget for this upcoming fiscal year for Boston. Very excited to hear her statement on that. I'm going to begin reading from an incredible article on gentrification, the myths, the truths behind it. I've read it 3 times now and I gained something from it each time. And we're going to end with maybe finishing the second half of the Right to the City vote housing forum for mayor. So definitely going to be fun. I'm keeping the lighting set up from yesterday until someone tells me it makes me look too pale. And as always, thank you so much for supporting. Please like, subscribe on TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you find it. Share the show. I'm not asking for any money yet. But let's get right into Andrea's statements. So as not necessarily everyone knows, but about a year ago, I was on a show with a good friend of mine, Lauren Pespiza, called Renters Radio. And we did a 2-hour special covering the Boston City Council vote on whether or not to pass Marty Walsh's budget. And the big drama at the time was, of course, we were in the middle of the George Floyd protest movement, sweeping changes, calling for defunding the police, for reinvesting in things that actually reduce crime, that actually increase public safety, which is programs which target poverty. Because as everyone knows, crime does not come because there are some people born good and others are born evil, any of that nonsense. Crime comes from when you have a high concentration of unemployed men, to put it plainly. And so divesting from a multi-hundred millions of dollar agency like the police, which has only ever existed to brutalize and terrorize and subjugate minority populations, poor people, and reinvesting in communities is the best way forward. And so what happened during that budget vote last year was candidates wanted to vote no against the budget and then enter into a negotiation with Marty Walsh to take advantage of the movement, take advantage of the awareness on the issue. There were 3, I will call them liberal members of the Boston City Council, Liz Breeden, Kenzie Bach, and Lydia Edwards, who decided to join the conservatives in blocking that effort and passing the budget. And I will probably do another show just going back on all of the statements that those candidates made. Because we were told that it was foolish of us to think that government worked by having mass movements in the streets and protests and calls to action. That was foolish of us. And that we need to trust the experts because they know how to actually tinker with the budget to get what everyone wants. And of course, we have the receipts. We have a year's worth of that effort. And what we found was that the Boston Police Department actually ended up making more money, taking more of the city's resources. And so the liberals, Kenzie Bach, Lydia Edwards, and Liz Breeden are going to be put in the same position they were last time. And now we have a new mayor who has put forward a multi-billion-dollar budget. I have not gone through every element. It is my understanding that it actually increases the amount of police while trying to do the same trick twice, which is limiting or reducing the overtime budget, which I have to continue to repeat, is a goal. Reducing the overtime budget is clearly a number that you hope the police reach. They are allowed to go over it. That is not a budget, that is a goal. Reducing that goal does nothing, as again we saw this year. And I believe Kim Janey's budget does exactly that. And so I am very excited to see how councilors like Julia Mejia, Ricardo Arroyo, and probably most notably, Michelle Wu, handles whether or not to pass or not pass, all the political decisions that go into that. So let's first hear from Andrea Campbell, who, if we had ranked choice voting, would be either my second or third choice. And she has, though, been very good on calling to defund the police. It is by far her best issue. She's probably the strongest candidate on that. So let's hear her statements. I'll react and pause as I go, as normal. And let's see. Let me move some things for the Twitch people.
Black residents account for 60%.
Oh, let me go back.
My supporters who are here, obviously it's a busy day, it's a hot day, so thank you to my people. Appreciate you. This past weekend, we obviously celebrated Juneteenth, commemorating the day formerly enslaved Black people learned they were free and celebrated their newfound liberation. When the ancestors celebrated that first Juneteenth, I know they hoped for better outcomes and brighter futures for themselves and their families. But instead, many were greeted with intentionally racist and exclusionary policies, whose effects are still felt today, like Black families in particular. We feel that here in Boston, with a shocking racial wealth gap that's actually only gotten worse, not better, since the Fed released a report years ago, where Black residents account for 60 to sometimes 70% of stop and frisk incidents, even though we only make up a quarter of the city's population. Where more than half of our Boston public school students, won't graduate from college. In this moment, I absolutely believe we need our city budget to respond to the urgent needs of our residents, so that everyone in the city of Boston can be safe and healthy, while investing intentionally in our schools, housing, workforce development, parks, and infrastructure to eradicate the systemic and racial inequities that families have experienced for generations. This week, Acting Mayor Janey resubmitted her FY22 budget, which I think does not meet the urgency of this moment, particularly in necessary actions on policing reform, addressing the homelessness and opioid crisis that folks are experiencing, particularly in Massive Pass, and of course other neighborhoods as well, and ensuring all of our BPS students are getting the education they deserve. We're here in Nubian Square where a year ago, thousands gathered to march and demonstrate, pushing city and elected leaders to reduce and reallocate money from policing. Where the city responded with a Black Lives Matter mural, on Washington Street, but did not end up actualizing any reduction to the police budget, which is over $400 million, an overtime budget of $70 million that continues to rise. Everyone who wants to see violence go down in our city should support dramatically shifting our budget to allow us to truly invest in strategies that address the root causes of violence and crime, which policing alone will never do.
All right, so far incredibly strong. Pointing to the creation of a mural for George Floyd without any tangible action, pivoting to how a police budget cannot and does not keep our citizens safe, and began with the multiple challenges and needs of the city, primarily education and solving, I will call it the mass incarceration crisis, but the lack of housing, the lack of opportunity. So far, very strong.
And should never be expected to do. Cycles of violence and incarceration are interrupted by opportunities to build wealth and ownership, and expanding access to excellent education, good jobs, affordable housing, mental health services, addiction treatment, youth jobs and programs, community-based violence prevention, and so much more. Cycles of criminalization that begin in our schools can be disrupted by removing police officers from our schools, implementing a restorative justice approach to school safety, by hiring more school clinicians, mental health clinicians, and social workers. Our budget must reflect that. Last year, myself and many colleagues, including our acting mayor, voted against the budget because it didn't go far enough to reduce that budget or propose a real plan to rein in overtime spending by a police department. And a full year later, the council is being asked to consider a police budget that does not look a whole lot different, that actually adds officers and provides no strategy whatsoever to actualize promised reductions to overtime.
Very good point she brought up was that Kim Janey voted against Marty Walsh's budget. That was basically the big tell that Kim Janey, Andrea Campbell, Michelle Wu would all be challenging Marty Walsh. Was that rejection? Okay, that is obviously a bit of a cynical comment, but as Andrea just pointed out, now that Kim Janey has the power, now that she's in those shoes, she's passing a budget which looks very, very similar, especially where it comes to the allocation of resources heading to the police.
That does not answer the call for change that I still feel and hear every single day, even if they're not quite as loud as last year. Last spring, my colleagues and I got thousands of calls and emails pushing us to reject the budget and push for greater reallocation, transparency, and accountability. The reason to do so this year are just as urgent as they were last year. And I think they're even more urgent, given the magnitude of what we know our department's systemic lack of accountability and transparency, the cover-ups and corruption that have all been on full display and frankly continue to further erode trust with the public. Significantly reducing our police budget and overtime budget will not be easy. It will require changing the way we do things. It will require us to exercise leadership and challenge the status quo. It will require reallocating our departments and restructuring our departments to ensure there's adequate coverage in our neighborhoods, to make sure we're making major changes to the union contracts. That is exactly what I would do as mayor, because it is essential if we want to transform this system to actually address the root causes of violence. And I'm really proud of the policy I put out. It is the only policy that specifically talks about how we would reallocate significant resources from the police department. In my plan, $50 million, reduce the overtime budget, and redirect those resources to the root causes of violence. There are urgent opportunities to address other crises in our city as well. And we cannot wait for the next mayor and the next administration to deal with what we are seeing in terms of the growing public health crisis and public safety crisis at Mass and Cass, which of course is pouring out into other neighborhoods, including in Nubian Square and other parts of the city of Boston. It is important that we have immediate investments, including federal dollars this summer, to make sure we're addressing the crisis there, that we invite residents to be a part of those discussions and at the table, which has yet to be done. In addition, our parents are in fear with respect to the learning disruption their students have felt during COVID-19 within Boston Public Schools. This is an opportunity for greater investments this summer for our families to make sure every single child has access to a tutor, every single child has access to outdoor activities, every single child has access to a mental health clinician. We still have yet to see meaningful investments there. As both a counselor and as a candidate, I've put forth actionable plans on all of these issues. And while my authority is very limited as a counselor, I know that a mayor with the swipe of her pen can make these things happen immediately. It can do.
Oh, see, fantastic. Pointing to Kim Janey having the power and not using it. Saying that Kim Janey could have as the power of mayor, solve all these issues, but is refusing not to. I mean, she is crafting the budget. So the reason the mayor is the most powerful position in Boston is just because you get to control the flow of resources. Now, obviously, there is a massive amounts of pressure that interest groups are pushing and pulling, and there is a reason why our elected leaders, even the ones that we have high hopes for, end up catering towards capital, because they have or are holding all the cards. However, she does have the power to submit her own budget, and that is always a standard that we hold people to, is what did you do with the power that you had? And Andrea is calling out Kim Janey, saying that she is not using the power to fix these issues. Good job.
Do so in partnership with residents who have been doing the work for years. I'm excited for not only the plans I put forward, but they are specific, they are practical, and they most importantly are informed by folks and stakeholders who've been doing the work for a really long time. And I'm lifting up what we're seeing in terms of Mass and Cass because I continue to be frustrated by so many with the lack of response from the administration, with all of the correspondence we've sent, the 30-day challenge, all of the ideas we've sent to the administration to respond to have yet to be addressed. So I'm looking forward to working and continuing to work in partnership with my constituents, with our residents to get these things done, and I look forward to taking your questions. So thank you.
All right. I don't think I need to hear any of their questions. That was good. Very strong going after Kim Janey. And really from a political standpoint, the polls have broken off into the 6 candidates into 2 different tiers. And we have the top tier candidates, as shown by the polling, to be Kim Janey, Michelle Wu, and Anissa Sabi George, has fluctuated wildly. One poll had her at about 10%, using data from a week after that, and a different poll had her at, I think, 22%. So Anissa has been all over the place. Kim Janey and Michelle Wu have consistently polled within the top 2. Andrea Campbell, despite being basically in a statistical tie with Michelle Wu for funding as the top fundraiser, has been in the second tier pack. And mostly it was the moment Kim Janey entered the race. Andrea, as I said, was going to have a very hard time distinguishing herself because up to that point, her pitch was that she was born and raised in Boston. Michelle was not. That she has some of the very same progressive policies as Michelle, but not some of the more ambitious. That was her pitch. And that pitch is identical to Kim Janey. And right now, they have gone back and forth in terms of who is better on policy. Kim Janey is better on some policy issues than Andrea. Andrea is better on others. But she lost the ability to identify herself the moment that Kim Janey entered the race. And I think out of everyone, I'm very excited, or I don't know if excited is the right word, about what Michelle Wu will do. Because I can see a reality where she is looking at the polls, she is looking at her chances and thinking, I do not, if it ends up being me and Kim out of the prelims, I do not want to put myself in a situation where I voted to close down the city by not passing the budget, and Kim Janey wanted to keep the city operational. Now, it's not exactly how it works. They go to a 1/12 budget, which sounds scarier than it is. It's basically just a continuum of people's salaries while you negotiate another one. But it will be spun against her as Michelle Wu, seeking crazy radical socialist goals, wanted to shut down the city, to take away and abolish the police, while Kim Janey was the responsible leader who didn't. These are there's someone in her ear saying this. And there's probably someone in Michelle's ear telling her to not give that narrative any weight and to instead to pass the budget. There's going to be somebody else in Michelle's ear telling her that she has to vote no. She voted no last time. She will lose her most progressive credentials. A lot of the youth support that is canvassing for her will leave her, and she needs that to get out of the prelims. That's going to be the argument from the left. And I can't wait to see what she chooses. Now, pivoting to the housing section, this article deserves really its own show. However, I want to go into it a very little bit and then probably return to it at some point, and we will get to the second half of the housing mayoral forum because I love housing. And so this article, written in Shelter Force by Brett McMillan, is again probably one of the best articles I've read on housing in a long time. And it's titled, "Gentrification is Not the Real Problem." I'm going to begin a few paragraphs down. Let's start by separating gentrification theory from reality. I will begin with the common narrative of gentrification. Oh, wait, did that just take it away from you all? Sorry. Of gentrification. Let me move this. I'm sorry. This is going to be frustrating for me. Bam. I'll begin in which, this is the common narrative, in which wealthy white people and developers move into poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, directly displacing the residents with the erection of new fabulous apartments. That's basically everyone's joint consensus of what gentrification is. This theory was introduced in the 1970s by geographer Neil Smith and was a theory to try to explain demographic patterns, because what you had previous to that was flight from the cities just around the 1970s. So I'm very curious what cities this person, Neil Smith, was looking at, because you saw a lot of white flight out of U.S. cities from the 1960s to 80s, heading to the suburbs. But at some point, there was also the reverse happening, with new development, speculative development, wealthier people going into poorer neighborhoods, right? This is the theory of gentrification. However, and now these are my words, looking at the data, it is actually very difficult to see if whether or not this theory holds any water. So, beginning here, in a 2005 study covering 31,000 households from 1980 to 2000, and all the time periods of this is very important, Freeman found that mobility out of gentrifying neighborhoods is not necessarily dramatically different from mobility out of other neighborhoods. And this is really the crux of the piece, and there are some people who will use these arguments disingenuously. This author does not. And he hits it a little bit more at the end. Let me read you some more. A little over a decade later, Ellen also found no significant differences in mobility among low-income residents who lived in gentrifying neighborhoods when tracking over 35,000 New York City children enrolled in Medicaid, and compared to those who lived in market-rate apartments from 2009 to 2015. Lastly, Quinton Brummett and David Reed, writing in 2019 for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, found moderate 4 to 6 percentage point increases in mobility among less advantaged residents of gentrifying neighborhoods. So this study showed some, 4 to 6%, from 2000 to 2014, using a sample population of 170,000. Whereas the non-gentrified areas still had mobility rates of about 70 to 80. So now we're talking, I don't know, anywhere from 76 to 86% for a difference. And that's really the crux of this. And the author hits it later, I'm going to say it now, which is that in all 50 states, we are seeing the cost of housing increase. In all 50 states and every major city there, we are seeing the cost of rent increase. We are seeing a higher percentage of people's income going to housing all over the place, regardless of your city's experiencing gentrification or not. And that's really what this article tries to get at, is that it is not in and of itself the phenomena of gentrification which is causing this, but it is the overall lack of housing, the fact that wages have been stagnant for decades, that people are just simply not making more money while costs continue to increase. And ultimately, it is the fatal decision, beginning in about the 1960s, of us no longer pursuing public housing as a collective strategy, to push it completely into the market, to allow housing to go from a good to a necessity, something that you literally need to survive, and transition that to a commodity, something which is to be bought and sold at a market. And the moment we made that full shift, we never was 100% against it, but the moment we decided to no longer pursue public housing and to push it into the hands of the market, we made it clear that if you do not have money, you do not get to engage in the market. And there is an ever-increasing population of people who simply do not have the money. And therefore, if you don't have the money, you don't exist in a market. So how do you find housing? And every program we have since, up until this day, is to try to have some very basic patchwork programs from the government to help subsidize that market exchange. But what we need, ultimately, and I guess I will end it here, and we're going to go to the mayoral forum, is to no longer treat housing as a commodity, to treat it as a public necessity, a public good, to take it out of the hands of the market, which will require a massive investment by the federal government, because while there are absolutely strategies that I advocate for at a city and state level, the moment that we are bound to the market, we are screwed. And we are ultimately picking at scraps and just trying to trim at the edges. And while I criticize a lot of quote-unquote liberal candidates for doing just that, and while I want people to swing for the fence, especially in negotiation, there is no doubt that we are severely limited in what we can do. So with that, I'm going to go back to this article quite a few times because we just scratched the surface, but we've been going for about 25 minutes, and I want to get to some of the second half of the housing hearing. So let's get to this.
In each neighborhood and connected together.
Let me
resilient across the board.
Here we go. I am here. I don't think anyone minds if I cover John Santiago's face. As always, if you're watching on the TikTok, I recommend switching to Twitch, YouTube. And they're going to reintroduce the question in just a second. Or I'm sorry, I was going to do a question in just a second.
Right now for the next question.
There you go.
Inclusionary Development Policy, or IDP, is currently 13%. What are your plans for increasing the percentage of IDP in your first 100 days? Please include what percentage you plan to increase to and what unit threshold you plan to require. Again, each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. And we will start with Councillor Campbell.
And then very quickly, so this was a question that we didn't get through when I did this a week or two ago, but it's really important. Let's hit it again. The IDP, Inclusionary Development Policy, is Boston's policy of if you're going to build, I believe it's a construction that has 10 or more units, there's also like a square footage size, then 13% of those units need to be not at market rate, but at an affordable level as defined as the AMI, as dictated by HUD, which is anywhere from 2 to 3 times the actual area median income. This is all my way of saying the 13% of the housing, which is meant to be affordable, is still 2 to 3 times more expensive than it needs to be actually be truly affordable to the people in that area. We have just recently been given the power by the State House to change that 13%, meaning we can require 20%, 50%. So the question is, what percentage would you put it at? And as I called before, because of the recent Suffolk Downs development was okay with 20%, that means that a massive multi-billion-dollar construction was more than fine giving 20% affordable because they know how much money they're making. And that is one of the biggest problems, is how opaque their return on investment is. And so I think the council is going to chicken out and accept the terms of capital, which the capital already said they're fine with 20%. I know what their responses are, but I guess that if you want to go fact check me the last time I did it.
Thank you, Andres, for the question. And I have spent a lot of time on this very issue. And frankly, it's an issue that's right before the city council right now in Councilor Edwards' committee. And so there's been a back and forth on what that could look like. I have committed to, in my housing plan currently, to expand citywide increase in IDP to 20% and to really look at certain neighborhoods like the Seaport, South End, Back Bay for a higher percentage, given what the economic numbers look like in those communities. I also am pushing for in my plan to have more on-site building occur, not simply to push for developers to put money into the fund, but also it's bigger than IDP, right? There are other financial tools that we need to be using in order to create more affordable housing. I'm really proud that my first piece of legislation on the council was a CPA, and it's generating millions of dollars for affordable housing. I would keep pushing for a large percentage of that to go to affordable housing. In my plan, I talk about transfer of development rights.
I am unclear
and this
what
tool
CPA
that can be used
is.
for some of the larger projects to expand, to transfer some of these rights to some of our community-based developers and smaller developers as a way to allow them and help them and assist them in building more affordable housing and being creative in how they do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll be having Councilor Asayim George.
Thank you for the question. I think it's so important that as a city and certainly as mayor, that I'm working to create better paths to home ownership, to build more affordable and more truly affordable housing, and focus on
I
creating
say this all the
opportunities for
time.
generational wealth. We know that
Pathways to
homeownership
home ownership is a
very
complete
valuable.
lie. It's a fiction. It's a fairy tale to get people to believe that they're going to get the golden ticket out. We will never be able to, on scale, have a pathway to home ownership as a realistic option on scale for the vast majority of people who need it. You can get a couple dozen, maybe 100 people, but that it's not a realistic housing strategy.
So much too. We need to make sure that as we look to create that more affordable housing, especially housing for our seniors, especially housing for our families, especially housing for our residents who are living with very low income, that we are creating more affordable housing. So when we think about IDP, when we think about inclusionary zoning, when we think about the percentages, it's certainly important for us to look to move to increase that 13%. But we also have to look to make sure that we are finding that sweet spot, that nexus between affordability and the number of units, and making sure that it's continued to be created over time. I think we can do that at 20.
Thank you. Sorry. Next, we'll be having Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much for this question. I am actually looking at this right now with my Chief of Housing, Sheila Dillon. This is an opportunity for us to create more mixed income development. And too often we have failed to do just that when affordable units are often placed off-site and not on-site. We need to look at both, making sure that when we need to invest in neighborhoods that need more affordable housing, that we're doing just that. And when there are opportunities to create mixed income development rather than another neighborhood that is very segregated by income and race, that we are taking advantage of that. Clearly, the current system is not working. We are creating too many opportunities for developers not to do the right thing, come right under that threshold, build big units in terms of the number, in terms of density, that are not meeting the needs. We are also, in addition to looking at the number of units and percentages, we're looking at square footage so that we can build more family housing for families, so that they can stay put and not be displaced from the city of Boston. Too often the housing is not meeting the needs of working families, and we have an opportunity now to do better in the city of Boston. That is what I am doing as mayor.
I don't think I heard Kim
Thank you,
Janey
Mayor.
give
Next,
us a
we're gonna have
number.
Representative Santiago.
We want a number. How much
Thank you for the
IDP?
question. Look, IDP and linkage fees have historically been great tools to capture revenue and to reinvest it into affordable housing. It's why I was very proud that as a state representative that me and colleagues led the fight up there that very last day of the budget to get it done, to allow Boston to do this. And I really want to give a shout out one to the advocates who were on the, I think Karen was on.
Also, I gotta say, every time I hear John Santiago speak, I am more and more convinced he has never thought of policy a moment in his life.
Passing these policies, we allowed a 42% increase in linkage fees and the ability to codify IDP, but it's just a start, right? We need to build on that work. We need to improve these tools, and we need to provide more affordable housing opportunities to our residents. And it's again, that's why I was proud to be one of the leaders to do that on Beacon Hill, and I support raising linkage fees, and making sure that we finally end that parking exemption, because right now linkage fees, do not include parking. And as mayor, I will end that exemption and to raise more revenue. And I also believe that we should be looking ways to increase that 13% requirement. We need more affordable housing, and we have the tools to make it a reality. it's important that the stakeholders be at the table and give this. I'm committed to also thinking outside the box. We have
Linkage fees is like a cost per square foot. Whenever you're doing a large-scale development, you have to put it into a fund that the city can then play with.
to have more tools on the table to increase our affordable housing stock. We need to use public money
What
to invest in
IDP
100%
number,
affordable units
John?
across the city of Boston. As mayor, I'm committed to doing that.
Did
Thank
he
you,
also not
Representative.
say
Next,
it?
we'll be having Councilor Wu.
Maybe I
Thank
talked
you,
to
Andres.
him.
To know how much of loophole or impact this is creating, you just have to go look at the ZBA agenda. On almost any given week to week, there are, especially in neighborhoods like East Boston, an influx of 9-unit buildings being proposed to ask for those variances because that's right under the threshold that you need to add to that affordability. And so I would propose the city of Boston really trying to close that loophole and make sure the thresholds are closer to the reality, to have a 20% minimum start, to work to ensure that as our economy recovers and as we are shifting back into a more fully reopened business and development sector, that we can increase it from 20% on up, and that we're
So you never start at the floor, this is one of my larger knocks on Michelle, is that you don't start with the lowest that you're willing to accept and then say, and we want to build from here. When you enter into a negotiation, you set about double what you hope to get. So I mean, Julian Mejia, I think, says 50%. To me, I would go in asking for 2/3. The Coalition for Truly Affordable Housing says 33% truly affordable, another 33% at their affordable limits, which is, again, people who make roughly 70, 80, 90 grand a year. And then you can have 1/3 for your luxury palaces or whatever you do. But you should never enter into a negotiation saying, I want a floor of 20%, because guess what you're going to end with? 20%.
dropping the threshold to start with buildings more than 6 units, which matches other ways that the city is categorizing buildings and our building stock across the board. This will better match development in our neighborhoods and the need for us to have, again, going back to the last question, a plan that works for everyone, that connects our neighborhoods to each other and ensures that we are not just pushing people out. And the last thing I want to say is that IDP is not the solution to affordability. We will never get enough affordable housing just by leaning on 20%, 30%. It will never be enough. We need to generate sources for funding for creating more affordable units, including through the city's capital budget and other revenue sources.
Thank you.
And
Next,
she is
we'll have Mr.
correct on
Barnes.
that. All right, I'm gonna skip John. Because I've already gone through this. And
有好多房屋
he's not
咧
going to say anything
都
interesting.
做緊轉手買賣。我哋相信喺鄰區其他嘅地方，同樣係面臨豪華化，亦都有同樣咁嘅情。
And I'm not going to skip over this. So how they're doing this, just for the people who listen to this, is they have people on videos asking the questions. And so this is a resident, and they will interpret it for the speakers. But we're going to respect this person and listen.
情況存在。你將採取邊種具體措施或者政策嚟到幫助社區信託，從呢個房屋投機性嘅市場中移動更多嘅房產，用於永久負擔得起嘅房屋、農場、花園同商業地方。
Thank you, Chen Ho-san. Let's start with Councillor Asabi George. Just kidding. I need to translate it.
That's Karen Shen. She's incredible.
Love that sense of humor.
That was great.
We need that joy and laughter.
Okay. So there's a lot of ownership turnover happening in Chinatown. I believe that is true from other neighborhoods that are faced with gentrification and influx of luxury development, or just development in general. So the question is, what specific measure or policy will you take to help community land trusts to remove properties from the speculative market for permanently affordable homes, farms, gardens, and commercial spaces? So we'll start with Councilor Asabi George.
No, I appreciate the question.
So community land trusts try to square the circle of what I just discussed, which is basically since the 1970s, throughout American history, but the complete closure and direction from the 1970s of housing as a commodity, as a private entity to be bought and sold on a market. And so what community land trusts attempt to do is to raise the capital that can then purchase those homes and those properties to then put them under community control. So it is asking people in the community to raise the money, obviously getting assistance from governments, nonprofits, to raise the money to purchase the properties on the market and then to reabsorb them into a community control format. It's trying to work within that market system to beat that market system and to, again, pull out that.
Question, and thank you. And one thing, as I work to answer that question, prepare to answer that question, I want to add something to the affordability piece. We need to also make sure as we have more,
they will all
units come
support
online,
community land
they
trusts.
truly do come online. Too long,
or at
many of
least
these developments
verbalize
across the
that they
city of
do.
Boston, those affordable units are the last to go, and they really need to be the first to get into the hands of our residents to be rented or to be purchased. The delay is too long. I've held the hearings on the council to speed that up. As it relates to community opportunities for the community, for greater ownership, for greater access, that's where we have to start. We have to start with creating more and more opportunities for ownership across our city. That creates stability for our families.
And I'm kind of convinced Anissa doesn't know what community land trusts are, because I think she's discussing ownership, again, as home ownership for individual families, which is not what a community land trust is.
And that creates stability for our community. We also need to work first and to lead the way first. As a city, when we think about city-owned parcels, city-owned land, city-owned property, we need to make sure that we are setting those parcels aside, that we are leading by example.
Yeah, she has no idea what community land trusts are.
Housing, when we're thinking about opportunities for
it's
urban
different
farming,
than city-owned property. It's not a municipal building or municipal
for our
land.
residents, for our communities. We need to lead the way with the portfolio that is currently under the authority of the city, and I will do that as mayor.
No idea what the question was. But sometimes it's tough to go first, I'll be honest.
We have Mayor Janey. I'm not sure if I translated the part about community land trust. I just want to clarify.
Yeah, Karen's going to repeat
So
it.
I will start there. So then we obviously need to make sure that there are opportunities for land trusts. And we've seen that happen in Roxbury, where it has taken an area that was just ravaged with vacant lots, housing that was burned down, and with community organizing, coming together to create a land trust. And now it is a vibrant neighborhood and community there. We definitely have to explore a vacancy tax. We have to, and that's not just on residential, that would be commercial. There is lots of opportunity here in terms of commercial space that we could be supporting small business owners.
So a vacancy tax would be huge, and it's something that a lot of the DSA-backed candidates are supporting as well, which is there is so many empty properties, speculative properties that are just bought and they just sit there. It's true with rental. It's also true, as Kim Janey's expressed, commercial. All these office spaces that are just sitting there empty and vacant. And so a vacancy tax, as it's stated, would simply put a tax on, if you're going to sit on property, if you're going to sit on housing in the middle of this crisis, we are going to tax you into eventually, my goal would be you tax it at, 15% a month. And after a certain point, you just purchase the property from them using the money that you raised from the vacancy tax. I doubt they'll do anything that ambitious, but we need to hit that hard.
Owners of color, immigrant business owners, we have to make sure that we are continuing to expand opportunities for home ownership. We have to look
see
at
how they all
the
keep saying that?
Conversion ordinance
Because they know it plays well. They know everyone wants the dream of home ownership. Everyone wants that dream, but it's a complete lie.
From 90 days to 6 months, a transfer fee. That I've already worked on, in my years on the council, and want to continue to move that forward. That would also help generate much needed revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars that we could invest in our community.
Yeah, it seems like Kim also did not want to spend the 90 seconds on
Next we'll
community
have
land
Representative
trusts.
San Diego.
Great. Well, thank you for the question, neighbor. What you are experiencing are things I hear all across the district. As someone who represents the South End, a place that has changed demonstrably, that has been gentrified over the past couple of decades. And I want to let you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to the advocates. And I'll be honest with you, community land trust wasn't something I was familiar with a couple months ago.
Told
I had
you.
a fantastic meeting with them a couple of weeks ago, and they've enlightened me. And I want to do the best to elevate their platform.
And the biggest tell that John doesn't really know what he's talking about is how many times he is asked a question and he stalls for about a minute saying, I am going to listen. I am going to learn. I am going to talk to the people. Because he just has never thought about policy. It's astonishing.
As an expert in Boston, I want to make sure that we are, we talk a lot about off-site housing and on-site housing. It looks like, they care very much about the off-site housing and have expand opportunities for community land trusts. I'm committed to doing that and working with the advocates to make sure that we can expand the power of community land trusts all across the city of Boston. I want to make sure that those folks have access to public property. So that means me not just serving as their advocate, but really investing in what they care about and what they do. It's not just about creating and preserving affordable housing. It's the opportunity to do this with farm and provide opportunities to address the food insecurity issue. So I'm going to partner with the activists and get this done.
Yeah, I don't think you will, John, because you don't seem
Thank
to
you.
know
Next we'll
what
have
people are talking
Councillor
about.
Wu.
Thank you, Karen. And I want to just thank the advocates across the city who, for decades now, have been pushing for greater focus on the fact that we can introduce permanent affordability with community ownership by removing land away from the tension that we're always putting it in. We talk about housing as a human right, that everybody should have access and everybody deserves a safe, healthy home and a roof over their head. And yet it is an item that we commodify, that we trade, and that we subject to the speculative market. And so in addition to public ownership,
Shell's been doing
through
a
the
economy
BHA
reading.
and through the Boston Housing Authority, and through expanding the mission of how city government can directly, using our capital budget, create and maintain affordable housing that is permanently affordable. We should also be creating preference for community-owned housing and open space that will be permanently affordable. We can do that through preference in our procurement process when we're disposing of public land and those parcels, that there should be a baked-in preference for community land trusts, nonprofit-owned community land trusts to be able to acquire these and have a process to engage community residents on what should go there. This is the long-term way to ensure that we are creating affordability in a permanent way and creating all of the amenities that every community deserves right in the neighborhood within walking distance and localize that impact.
Now, I was surprised Michelle didn't point and spend time on how community land trusts are an example of the democratization of development and the decision process in what gets built, especially when it comes to housing, and how it is managed. And then contrast that with the current policy over ownership by the BPDA, which is basically recklessly allowing speculative private building, where community gets to decide, and not just decide what gets built, but also then govern the properties. I'm surprised she didn't hit that. But fantastic job pointing to housing as a commodity versus a human right.
Thank you.
Points.
Next we have Mr. Barros.
All right, now we'll listen to a bias. What do you got?
My colleagues supporting the notion of community land trusts. But on this panel, I'm the only one that, in fact, has worked with a community land trust, led a community land trust, has acquired land, has, in fact, acquired land for urban farming, for affordable commercial, and open space, and affordable housing. I will, in fact, as mayor, double the city's funds that DND currently has to work with our urban land trusts, our urban community land trusts, particularly around urban farms. We need to develop at least 25 new urban farms by 2025. I'm committed to that. And then we need to make sure that we've got the kind of land trust fund for preservation of affordable housing and community priorities. I committed to $5 million of community land trust fund. I've committed to increase the funds per unit so the acquisition of more expensive units in our communities can happen and be acquired by community land trusts. I've committed to make sure that we are pairing project-based vouchers for operation subsidies to community land trusts for permanent affordable housing. In fact, while I was Chief of Economic Development, I helped to move the city to a permanent affordable housing covenant, and I'm very proud of that work. I've helped to build the largest urban land trust in the country, and it's not just about community land trusts. It's in fact about the people in the neighborhood having a say about what happens in their community, and as mayor, I'm committed to do that for the city.
Ah, John knew what he was talking about. Look at that. I guess the Council of Economic Development has worked with housing, community land trusts. Look at that.
Thank you. Next we'll have Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, and I have to give credit to Barrows because I did learn a great deal from him about community land trusts, and I have to give a shout out to John Smith, who is currently at DSNI and lives in my district, who has been a part of the advocates and the coalition for the city of Boston to expand our ability for community land trusts. And so I have committed to a few different things on this very issue. One is leveraging the city of Boston's assets. So really pushing for the work within our neighborhood housing division. This is, of course, a city entity that holds our land and foreclosed properties, turning that into a high functioning land bank and focusing the lending power from this to small nonprofits to allow them to build more affordable housing and to push them to use employers and contractors who are from the city of Boston and who are diverse. Acquisition, critically important. I was happy to see in a recent council hearing that there were some federal dollars going to this purpose. I would add more resources. There are millions of dollars coming in from the federal government. Put it into this fund, make it easier for Chief Dill and her team to acquire these properties. Millions also coming in. Double, I think we need to think about doing a little bit more than that in terms of the community land trust, because we know it's not just about affordable housing, it's a whole host of other purposes. And I'm also really proud that as a councilor, I started the vacant lot initiative. I'm pushing the city of Boston to activate our lots for community purpose. I would expand upon that and continue that work in the city of Boston.
And one thing that I am unfamiliar with, because Andrea Campbell was discussing nonprofits purchasing the company, because one of the reasons that community land trusts to me is so effective is that they are collectively managed in a democratic way. Some of them. And so I am now would like to do some research on the different community land trusts throughout Boston, because if they are simply managed by a nonprofit in a hierarchical, you got a CEO and a board that they decide things, well, then I'm sorry. That is just replacing one small group of elites with another. And unless it is actually truly democratically controlled, governed, and managed in the way that I know some are, then it's just window dressing if you think that's actually going to change something. But let's end it there. Almost made it through this forum. Housing is something that I spend a lot of time reading and discussing in my own advocacy, so I keep interrupting them. The big fight is going to be next Wednesday for the budget hearing, so I'll absolutely be covering that then. We'll see what's on the docket tomorrow. As always, thank you for watching and viewing. If you could please go over to Twitch, YouTube, give me a like and subscribe there, boost me in the algorithm. I, of course, appreciate my TikTok people. But if you want the visuals, you get to go there. So I'm going to say goodbye to the Facebook, YouTube, Twitch